concessions have been made that actually allow industrialized nations to cut down the trees in developing nations. Developing nations are looking for short-term solutions. In other words, they're looking for income right now. So a concession, essentially, let's put a definition for this. A concession is a right to extract a resource. So if I'm the president of a developing nation, I can give a concession to a wealthier nation and give them the right to come in and extract my resources. Developing nations are looking for short-term solutions. They need money, and they need the money right now. They might need to feed their people. They might need to increase their sanitation. They might need to have money to increase their agriculture. So if they need money right now, they can sell the rights to their trees to a developed nation that can come in and cut down their trees. That's called a concession. On the flip side of that, there are actually some plans where wealthy nations come in and pay the poorer nations to not cut down their trees. This is obviously what an environmentalist would want to see happening. Now, there's no binding agreement for this, but this was something that was addressed in the 2009 Copenhagen Climate Conference. Copenhagen Climate Conference. The original idea was for this to be addressed in the Kyoto Protocol, but they just never really got around to addressing the idea of forest conservation. So the next time all the countries came together in 2009 for the Copenhagen Climate Conference, a special committee was developed to talk about the idea of conserving forests. Now, the name of the committee, I do want you to know it, and it is kind of long, so I'll read it a few times for you. It ends up being abbreviated. I'm going to write up here at the top as RED, R-E-D-D. Okay, and this came out of the Copenhagen Climate Conference, was this committee called RED. RED stands for, here we go, it's kind of long. I'll read it through once, and then I'll go through and repeat it. It stands for Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and Forest Degradation. It's a long name. So, Reducing Emissions from Deforestation and forest degradation. Let's go through it again. Reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. Reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation. There's no binding agreement here. There was no actual law. But what this did is it set forth kind of a protocol for what should happen, where wealthier nations would actually give money to the developing nations to conserve their forests, rather than the other way around, where the developing nations were getting money from developed nations in concessions. So we see this history, we know this pattern right now because of our knowledge and because of our desire to conserve. We're working towards ideas of stopping this and slowing down the rate of deforestation on the whole globe. Okay. When you drive around, you can actually kind of pay attention to the scenery, and you will see areas where this deforestation is happening. Now, in the United States, most of our forestry occurs in the South and in the Pacific Northwest. But you can see proof of our loss of primary forests. Now, obviously, whoever owns these trees on this mountain is being smart. They're not cutting down all the trees. They're not clear cutting the forest. But you can see that they're going through year by year and taking out different areas of the forest. You can clearly see this path straight through the middle here where they did some farming probably the previous year. And all that's grown back in here is little shrubs. So you've lost the primary forest on that hill. So when you're out driving, when you're on family vacations, pay attention to this, kind of look for it, and you will see it when you start to watch. This process of, deciding how to manage the trees that you're going to actually cut down is called silviculture. It's just a fancy word for forest management. How are you going to use your resources? So we want to use our resources wisely. We want to use our resources sustainably, and there's different ways to do this when we're farming trees. When we're working as a forest manager, most forest managers are looking for what's called the maximum sustainable yield. Okay, and if you think about that definition, the definition's in the term. Maximum, you want the most. Sustainable, you want to be able to sustain. Yield, we want to get the most yield, the most trees over the longest period of time. So we want to get the most without depleting the resource. There are some downfalls to using maximum sustainable yield. Let's actually draw a graph of what this looks like first before we talk about the downfalls, because I think it'll make more sense. So if we, on the next slide, draw a population growth on a logistic curve, you'll be able to figure out the time when a forest manager would want to harvest the trees for maximum sustainable yield. Let's draw that curve. So we're talking about over time, and we're talking about the size of the population. And we're talking about a logistic growth curve. Okay, so growth starts off slow, has a rapid increase, and eventually will level off. We've seen this graph before. This imaginary line up here, this is our carrying capacity. With no other external forces, this population, here we're talking about population of trees, but this is true for all populations. With no other external forces, this population wouldn't grow exponentially forever. At some point, forces in the ecosystem would cause the population growth to level off. Okay, now take your knowledge of what you know about slope of a line. You can tell when there's faster growth occurring in the population and when there's slower growth occurring in the population, just based on what you know about the slope of a line. So down here we have slow growth, and up here we have slow growth, because the line is very flat. Right here, where the line is the steepest, this would be the fastest growth. Now, if I'm a forest manager and I want to harvest the trees at the time where I will have the maximum production of the trees, where I get the most yield out, I'm going to want to cut down my trees somewhere around this fastest growth point. So this right here is when I would harvest. So if you think about what that means, what you might want to write down a note for yourself, what this means about the time for harvest, is I'm actually harvesting my trees before they're all grown. I'm not waiting until my population is as big as it possibly could be. Size of population is over here. I'm harvesting right now before my population actually gets as big as it could, because I want to harvest around the time that the growth is the fastest. So let's go back and talk about downfalls to this again. So I'm getting the maximum amount of growth without depleting the resource, but there's really a major downfall here. The downfall is that I'm only getting about half the maximum population. I'm never letting my ecosystem grow to its full number of trees. That means that I'm altering the ecosystem and I'm altering some habitats. There are some species that can only live in mature trees. Some bird species, some insect species that have evolved to only live in mature forests. If I'm never letting my forest grow to its maximum size, I'm never going to have those species living in my forest. So the downfall is, although I am maximizing my production, I'm altering my ecosystem. I'm altering my habitat. I'm never going to have beyond about half of my maximum population. Some forest managers are trying to get away from this maximum sustainable yield idea because they would like to minimize the impact on the ecosystem. And this train of thought is called ecosystem-based management. In ecosystem-based management, you try to cut down the trees in a way that doesn't disrupt the ecosystem. Okay, so we're trying to minimize the impact on the ecosystem. But how do you think you do this? It's really just, if writing down in your notes, it's kind of like a guess and check process. It's very hard to manage. You have to understand the whole ecosystem, which is a very complex process. So you have to try something and see what the impact is. And the next year, try something else and see what the impact is. So in reality, what typically happens is most forest managers use a combination of both of these. Okay, write that down, because the forest managers, of course, they want a healthy ecosystem. They want to maintain a healthy forest so they can get the maximum yield. But they understand that the sustainable maximum yield has those downfalls. So they try to integrate this ecosystem-based management where they don't disrupt the ecosystem at all. Okay, adaptive management is going through and figuring out, systematically, scientifically testing all these different approaches to try to find the best plan. And adaptive management really came into being because of pressure from the government. In the 1990s, there was a lot of controversy over in the Pacific Northwest over the spotted owl. And the government came up with what was called the Northwest Forest Plan in 1994. The spotted owl controversy was really between the loggers and the preservationists. The loggers wanted to go in the Pacific Northwest and cut down trees and use them as income. The preservationists wanted these forests to be left completely alone because they didn't want the breeding ground and the habitat of the spotted owl to be disturbed. So the government stepped in and really pushed for this adaptive management, a combination of the ecosystem-based management and the maximum sustainable yield, to try to find a way to use the resources wisely. They really brought in the science. They ran experiments. They ran experiments on different plots of land to test and find the best way for using the resources. All right, what land does the government actually have the right to go in and do this with? What land can the government actually step in and put regulations on? Let's kind of talk about that for a second. First, we have to talk about where we get our timber from. And then we'll talk about, who makes the decision and how we actually get the timber. So most timber in the United States actually does come from private lands. Most timber in the United States comes from private land that's just owned by the timber industry. Okay. But there are some public lands, national forests, where we get trees and timber from. So just a little bit of history that we need to know about this, we want to write down, is a focus on the timber industry began around the beginning of the 20th century, so around the turn of the century in the 1900s, because of fear of a timber famine. People started looking around and started worrying that we were going to run out of trees, that we'd used so much, we've cleared so many trees for farming and for industry, that we would run out of trees. And as a response to that, at the time, we started a movement to have some national forests where the government could control the rate of the deforestation. Okay. Gifford Pinchot, his name has come up before. His name is associated with this. Gifford Pinchot. He pushed for using land for the greatest good. He pushed for this conservation of the land. Let's use the land, but let's use the land wisely. Okay. When the national forests were first set up, they were mostly set up to just leave the land alone. Now we actually use that land for foresting, for forestry. In national parks, trees are cut down and sold for timber. Okay, this has declined since about the 1980s. We're kind of getting back to leaving the national parks alone, but you should know that there is forestry, logging occurring in national forests. About 8% of the United States is in a national forest at this point. So almost 10% of the land in the United States is owned by the government and can be used however the government sees fit. Remember, we are getting